Parliament is tomorrow expected to vote on a motion to scrap the 30% pass mark, or at least pass rate, as described by Build One South Africa. The motion was commissioned by the leader of Build One South Africa, Mmusi Maimane. Maimane argues that 30% is a low threshold that does a disservice to the country. He joins us now to speak about his party's confidence ahead of the vote tomorrow. Mmusi, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Before we get into the substance of it, I think we do need to talk about the effect that this vote would have. It ultimately wouldn't change anything just yet, except it's a motion and that states the view of Parliament, but it doesn't compel the minister to change the policy or it doesn't introduce a new law. That would have to be through a bill vote. But why is this vote nonetheless important for you?
It's absolutely crucial because I think it's criminal that we ask young people to pass school at 30% or to pass any subject at 30%. I think it also communicates deeply about our level of ambition as a country. So the motion in and of itself doesn't just deal with the question of 30%. It articulates a number of reforms in education, and it sets a curriculum and an assessment reform, which means that the minister will, by at least a resolution of Parliament, have to say to herself that she needs to take that into account, make the appropriate adjustments. Assessment criteria is something that is well within her purview, and so I would urge the Minister of Basic Education to have a deep appreciation of what the people of South Africa are asking for, and Parliament is the only place where South Africans are represented, and therefore it will be important for her to take that into account when she goes and does assessments for next year.
Okay. Mmusi, are you not perhaps having a non-existent debate? Because let's talk about what the worst case scenario pass actually does constitute. And that is just passing on national senior certificate. You must obtain 40% for your home language, 40% for 2 other subjects. So that's 40% for 3 subjects, and then 30% for 3 other subjects out of the 7 subjects. If you average the worst case scenario, that's not 30%, it's at worst case scenario 35%. And if we look at last year's statistics of 2024 matric class, it is only 189 learners out of 727,000 learners that actually passed on the bare minimum worst case scenario. We're talking here, Mmusi, about 0.03% of last year's class. This seems to be a non-existent problem.
No, it's completely a misdiagnosis of the issue. Because when you look at it from that perspective, then let me ask the question, what is the material harm that would happen if you said, instead of us just passing at 40% for the 3 subjects and 30 for the other 3, why don't we move it up? Because frankly, if we are asking learners to be proficient at 30, we're setting them up for failure. Secondly, when that same child, which the majority of students, in fact, only a few get a bachelor's pass, which they go up. If you really had to benchmark South Africans against 50%, which is what a university would assess it at, or a TVET college would assess it at, you would discover that the majority of our students who get a national senior certificate are only being prepared for unemployment. So it's not just a question of just, and this 30% number tells you that in core subjects like math, science, technology, economics, when you look at some of those subjects and you were to say to yourself, you benchmark at 30%, the number of learners who in fact pass mathematics are then at 67%. But if you move it up to 50%, you discover that that number drops down literally to 30%. So it tells you that we've got a 30% population of matriculants who are passing mathematics at 50%. And when we benchmark ourselves internationally, we then realize that Asian countries who have, at the same period of the last 30 years, have been able to develop economically and ended up in the G20, you discover that the majority of their assessment is based on 50%. Why are we setting the standards low? I often say to people, Oliver, that if at the Olympics, I have to run a 100-meter race, and I have to run it at 10 seconds to qualify. Of course, I have to do a whole lot of things to get that 10%. I have to eat well, I have to train well. There's a whole routine that goes into it. I can't say, well, I can't eat well or train well, therefore please make it 15 seconds for the 100-meter rate. that would be asking standards to be lowered.
Okay, let's test that on the actual numbers, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, your idea of what it should take to pass Matric is that the bare minimum pass should be whatever gets you into university, and that is, let's call it a 50% average, right? Am I understanding you correct on that? So anyone who falls below that threshold, so anyone below that threshold should not be passing Matric. Am I understanding you correct? In your view, that is.
Of course, I don't think so. I think why are we accepting less?
Okay, so let's look at the numbers, Mmusi. 47.9%, almost 50% of those who wrote Matric last year actually passed with a bachelor admission pass. That is to say, good enough to get into university. That's 50% of the 727,000 learners, right? If you are to say anyone who didn't pass must remain behind, are you not afraid that you're taking learners who otherwise could do well in a technicon or a college that has a lower admission requirements than that, because there are ways in which they will address the pedagogical gaps that would have existed across the span of the 12 years through a bridging program and through additional support programs. They're able to ensure that the learner catches up and that they're able to complete a diploma program at a bare minimum, which makes them employable. Should we not then rather focus on that rather than retaining so many, half the learners in Matric, once again subjecting them to overcrowded classrooms with a shortage of teachers where our resources just don't stretch to?
Well, let me first of all say that the proof is always in the pudding. So to your exact analogy, if I keep matters exactly the same, change nothing, don't change the assessment criteria and keep it exactly the same, just over 8 million young people are in needs. They're not in employment, they're not in education, they are not in training. The reality of it is that the majority of citizens who are unemployed have a sub-matric or the current equivalent matric that you are describing. The throughput level at a TVET college, when you put the same learners with the same national senior certificate, is now at 9%. So the point is, keeping the standards low does not cure the very problem you are describing. So when we say that, of course, at 47% as those who passed with a bachelor's degree, we must then as a nation say to ourselves, that is our realistic Matric pass mark, not this fictitious 80%, because that 80% is quite deceptive when you think about it from this perspective. If 8 out of 10 of our learners at the age of 10 cannot read for meaning, how do they suddenly, through a system, end up passing so significantly and getting 80%?
Yeah, but Mmusi, you're now critiquing a different problem. You're now critiquing a problem of the actual content of what is being taught, which is a curriculum question and not a pass rate question.
No, it's not.
But just maybe an
assessment question.
Just maybe a last question to consider here. Are you not perhaps trying to solve a resource crisis through other means other than talking about resources? And I'll tell you why I say that's the case. Let's assume that the 50%, that the bare minimum threshold would be a bachelor admission pass. That is to say 50%. And 727,000 learners sit for Matric, they write it, and they achieve that. But you have less than half of them being able to go to university because of the amount of available spaces in university. You still have so many learners that will get lost in the system because there's a resource limitation.
No, the point is, of course, not everyone is going to end up at university. But now if I send them to TVET, they've got a higher quality Matric pass, which means their throughput is much better. When I put them to the job market, they've got a skill that they can sell. If I send them overseas, they can compete with G20 member nations. That's the options I'm putting forward. But if I just simply keep it at 30%, I'm really preparing them for unemployment. And it's not just...
So what happens to the bottom half that fail?
It's about triggering reform.
What happens to the bottom half that...
reform.
What happens to the bottom half that fail? What do you do with them?
You have already conceded defeat before you've started. The point I'm trying to make is, when schools go to schools that have achieved 100% pass mark last year, speak to the headmaster and ask them what was their expected pass mark in the classroom. They will tell you they benchmarked it at 60%.
You're answering a question
to push the system up.
You're answering a question I didn't ask. The question is, what happens to the bottom half of learners that don't pass?
What I'm saying to you is that if you progressively move it up 35, 40, 45, 50%, you are going to force your education system to ensure that young people and more young people pass.
Okay.
But lowering standards is not the solution here.
We're going to have to leave it there. Mmusi Maimane, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Mmusi Maimane is the leader of Build One South Africa.